So our centering words for the sermon today actually come from St. Francis, and he offers us these words, which I think about a lot. I think they're very powerful. He says, "No one knows his name, the man who lives on the streets and walks around in rags. Once I saw that man in a dream. He and God were building an extraordinary temple." I was at an educational event a few years ago discussing homelessness. The topic was homelessness, and the event featured a panel of many of our local social service leaders. There was a lot of the leaders of our social service teams in the community in Bloomington. And the subject of ending homelessness came up, the idea that what we want to do is not just manage homelessness, but we want to end it. We want people to no longer be homeless anymore. And one of the panelists made a gentle, kind of offhand comment to not worry too much about that, because even Jesus thought the poor will always be with us. And that was my reaction too. And I don't think this person meant this in too serious a way, but it's a comment that I've heard far too many times, and perhaps you as well have also heard it far too many times, used in political arguments to basically dissuade people from trying to end poverty. Jesus said poverty is forever, so we should think so too, right? And more recently, this quote, has been spending a lot of time kind of murking through my subconscious, and I've been wondering about it. I've been thinking about it. What does it mean? Is that really what Jesus meant? Is there some deeper meaning here? Should I just ignore this quote and move on? Now, while I don't personally take the Bible literally, I do try to take it seriously, if for no other reason than it is the most important book to over 2 billion people on the planet. And truthfully, I feel that way with all the world's scriptures, that it's important to perhaps not take them literally, but certainly to take them seriously. And particularly when it comes to strange or difficult texts in the various world scriptures, I like to wrestle with them rather than just straight up dismiss them. I like to kind of work with them and see that maybe there's some kind of value in those quotes when you consider them from a deeper or different point of view. And this quote, "The poor you will always have with you," comes from kind of a rather obscure story that appears in slightly different ways in all 4 Gospels of the Bible, which is interesting that it sticks around. It's a story that appears in several different ways. And in 3 of those 4 versions, Jesus does in fact say, "You will always have the poor with you." So that quote carries across several of the Gospels. And the simplest version, these versions are very different in some ways, but the simplest version is probably the Gospel of Matthew. And in that gospel it reads, "Now while Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper," it's always an interesting thing that when, to see that Jesus was at the home of a leper, a person with leprosy. And I think that's a powerful thing. But "Now while Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of a very costly ointment, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when the disciples saw it, they were angry, and they said, 'Why this waste? For this ointment could have been sold for a large sum of money, and the money given to the poor.' But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, 'Why do you trouble the woman? She has performed a good service for me, for you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me.'" So that's the context in which that quote comes, for you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. So, I got to be honest, that's an odd story. And it's an especially odd story to pull that quote out of. It's like kind of out of the blue. And, I have to ask that that's the story that declares that there's nothing we can do about poverty, that poverty is eternal and forever. And coming from a man who has said, "Blessed are you who are poor, and the first shall be last, and the last shall be first, and sell all your possessions and give money to the poor, give the money to the poor," I tend to be with the disciples. Sell the oil and give the money to the poor, and at least one version of Jesus would have been two. But at least it's pretty clear from the context that this was not, from this story, this was not some deeply provocative political statement that we were to use for millennia to ostracize the poor. That's not really, when you look at that story, that doesn't really seem to show forth in this. And we really don't, to some degree, even know what's going on here. Maybe Jesus was having a bad hair day or something, and this kind stranger, he is known for having amazing hair, and this kind stranger, maybe hinting back at the "he is who without sin cast the first stone" story, comes and she takes care of him, just a gentle, humble woman who cares for him. And the disciples, they were a little judgy of this tender woman, so basically Jesus maybe just tells them to cool it. She's doing a nice thing. And there also is, in this story, there is this, "my life will be over soon" thread. So the author of the story, we know now that Jesus didn't write the Gospels. We know that individuals and groups maybe even wrote the Gospels. So the author is probably to some degree trying to tell the readers and listeners that Jesus knows his death is coming soon. And it's unlikely that this story even actually dates back to Jesus at all. But what I find most interesting about this whole story, setting aside all the context, is just the questionable quote itself. "The poor you will always have with you." What does Jesus mean when he says the poor? And I had a sneaky suspicion, I don't know why, there's something just was niggling inside of me, that when Jesus uses the word poor, he might be actually saying something different than when we use the word poor, that his meaning of poor and ours might be different. And it actually turns out that that's true, that the word he was using is different than the word when we use poverty. They mean different things. And in Greek, which is the original language of the Gospels, there are actually two words for poor. Of course, Jesus spoke in Aramaic, but the Gospels were written in Greek. And the original language, there are actually two words for poor. And the first is something called penes. And I may be pronouncing this incorrectly, but that's as good as I'm going to get. But penes, which generally refers to the working poor, people. The penes describes people who are working poor, and they're working in shops and fields, and they do manual labor to survive. And the word is often used in contrast to plusios, which is a member of the leisurely, land-owning, or wealthy class, one who does not work, but has free time for education and politics and such, the elite. So in this breakdown of the poor, there is people who work and then people who own stuff and don't work. And that's and that's it. That's the society. There's just those two groups when talking about that type of poverty. But the second word in Greek for poor is ptochos. And this is a person who lives through begging, through panhandling, through asking for money. They are completely destitute. The penes are completely destitute of all resources, and they have lost all their family or social ties. They're disconnected from any history, from any past, from the people that came before them. They're separated and apart. They often wander from town to town to survive, and so they are, if you will, foreign to the people of a given community. People don't necessarily know who they are because they're very disconnected, and they move often. And this group generally includes the people with very severe disabilities, often mental illness, disease, or physical incapacity. They are generally not permitted to enter the city walls at that time. Cities generally had walls around them, and the cities were contained within the walls. And so these folks, the Patojos, were not permitted to enter the city walls. They were kept on the outskirts of town, and they lived there and again begging to survive. So when Jesus used the word poor in this famous quote of the poor being with us always, he actually used the term Patojos. He used the term of the, if you will, the begging poor. And that clues us into two really important insights. The first is that Jesus, assuming these words came from him, was not making a statement about the justice of the economy. He was not claiming the working poor, in contrast to the wealthy elites, would be with us always. So this should never be used to break down any calls for transforming our society to a more economically just one. That's not what he was saying by saying the poor are always going to be with us. He was not saying that means that society will forever be unjust and there will forever be poverty. That's not what he meant. But what Jesus was saying is that we would always have the Patojos with us. We would always have extremely vulnerable people living among us, people with very severe challenges and disabilities, people who have been abandoned, people who have been ostracized, kicked to the edge of our society, people that we may find unpleasant, frightening, even, to use a very strong term, gross. They will always be with us. He's saying that people in that situation, in that circumstance, is a part of human existence. And now, maybe you start to see where I might be going with this. You know, we very much continue to be a society, a culture, a people, a nation, a world, with both the Penes and the Patojos. Most people experiencing homelessness actually fit into the Penes, the working poor. They lost their home because their bills piled up. They had a medical emergency. They lost a job. They lost childcare. Their car broke down, and their situation can absolutely be transformed by a more just economy. The average stay in homelessness is about 30 days. And most people who experience homelessness never experience it again. It's a one-time, awful experience that once they're out of it, they don't return to it. It's not a permanent situation, but one that can be remedied through changes in our laws and our policies and our behaviors. As Mandela said, like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural, it is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. But with respect to the Penes, if we apply Jesus' phrase of the poor you will always have with you, the working poor you will always have with you, if we interpret it that way, we are actually applying it wrong. We're not speaking incorrectly. His words, again, are not meant to be a justification to perpetuate or believe poverty is a permanent state that cannot be changed through our actions. And people who use it that way are actually not being true to Christian scripture. But today's sermon isn't so much about the Penes and not so much about economic change. That those are big topics and certainly topics for another day. But this sermon is really particularly focusing on who Jesus was talking about, which is the Patojos, about the people who we often struggle to accept. This is a sermon about the panhandler and the mentally ill person who wanders the street, the person trapped in addiction following a lifetime of physical and sexual abuse, the scary former foster kid who has known only violence and abandonment, the woman in the wheelchair, the senior with cancer living out of their car, the transgender teen who sells her body to survive. In homeless lingo, we describe many of these folks as chronically homeless. The average age of death for a chronically homeless person is 47 years old. And I'm 52 now, and I think about that often. So when Jesus talks about the poor, this is who he's talking about. They existed then and they exist now. They have severe challenges, some certainly human-made through abuse and neglect, and some that just come from being human, being alive. And for some of us, maybe all of us, their existence is hard to accept. We don't like that they're there. We often wish that they would go away, that they'd be out of sight, out of our space, outside the wall. In Jesus' times, they were seen as untouchables. And while we no longer have walls, physical walls outside our cities to force them to stay beyond, we so often deny their very existence, living as if they aren't there or wishing that they weren't. We refuse them access to many of the basics of society: decent food, a safe home, quality health care, a loving community. People often talk about our services for people experiencing homelessness in Bloomington as that they're so good. It's like our town, really, the services are so good, and that attracts people from outside our community. And I'm often like to remind them that our services aren't as good as the county jail. You know, just recently I saw a local political official actually become upset on social media because some community members had complained to them that there were tents up during the day at a local park, that a number of people experiencing homelessness had put tents up at a local park during the day. And I was frustrated by this, that they were not upset that people actually existed in this state, but that they were visible to the community in a way that they found unpleasant. It was seeing them and seeing their existence and seeing these tents that troubled them. And the comments written in response to her statement were some of the most prejudicial, hateful things I've ever read, and there wasn't a peep from this official limiting or preventing such derogatory thinking. You know, it was a response of disgust and toxic fear, seeking to close the gates on the undesired. And, since that time, after there were so many complaints about those tents have now been banned inside our city parks. That just happened about a week or so ago, where those complaints actually led to the city deciding to ban tents at all in our city parks. It's not clear to me Jesus meant it this way, or truthfully if even he said all this, but when I hear the poor shall be with you always, and understand he means people with severe disabilities and challenges who are often shunned by society, I hear something that forces me to expand my awareness and acceptance of what is real. When he says that, when he talks about these folks in these conditions being with us always, I hear something that forces me not to push people away, but to expand my sense of what is real. It calls me to be present and to be engaged and to witness, and to allow that witness to stir my compassion. To react is to deny, it is to push away, it is to shun, it is to pretend something it doesn't exist. But I find myself not interested in pretending. I'm interested in people, even the ones, maybe especially the ones whose existence challenges my capacity to take them in. I believe transformation, human transformation, begins by first allowing something to be, allowing ourselves to take it in, to acknowledge it, to accept it, that is a means of our capacity to grow, is that we can witness something. It doesn't mean we accept injustice and things like that, but we allow ourselves to be present to it and to realize it's there. And in my understanding of the world, our goodness grows in our lives. Our goodness, our capacity for goodness grows as we gain in our capacity to take in more and more truth, more and more reality. It's almost like concentric rings, that our capacity to become a better person grows as we expand our rings of truth, that we are capable of taking in more and more of what is real. To be one with each other, if you will, which for me is maybe the highest human capacity, is a process of increasing and expanding our ability to take each other in, that we grow in our ability to take each other in. And that begins with a very simple practice, with bearing witness. Compassion, as I understand it, is not something we force. It's not like we don't make ourselves like, I'm going to be compassionate today. I think it's more something that we allow, that we let happen. And we can spend a lot of time reacting to the world. And we usually do so in one of two ways. Instead of allowing the world, we react, we can respond. We kind of have this reaction. And these reactions tend to show up in, I think, two key ways. One is that we try to push something away. We have a reaction where something happens, we experience it, and we react by trying to push it away. Or the opposite reaction, which is we try to pull it towards us. And so a lot of times we spend ourselves in these unconscious reactive modes of trying to push something away or pull something towards. We push away what we don't like, what scares us, what disgusts us, strong term, what angers us. And we pull towards ourselves things we do like, things that please us, that make us feel good, or things we think we need, or even that we become addicted to. But if we kind of step out of those push and pull reactions into what I might describe as the space in between, we find a place that the Buddhists call equanimity. They talk about a place outside of those reactions or in between those reactions, and they call it, where we're not pushing away or pulling towards, they call it equanimity. And I believe in that space, the space of attention and witness without reaction. I believe that's where compassion emerges. Again, something not that we force into reality, but we allow, that we allow a space of equanimity. That's where compassion emerges in us. And by recognizing that we will always have the poor with us, as Jesus defined poverty, rather than resist or even condemn something because we don't like it, we can begin by accepting something that will always be a part of our lives. People with severe disabilities, people who often cannot fully care for themselves, people who don't fit into our notions of safe, capable, healthy, or pretty, will always be with us. And it's important that we step out of pushing away what we so participate in when we struggle with something's existence, and step into a deeper appreciation of who and what is real. And in doing so, with acceptance, bearing witness, we step into acts of compassion that support and care for those that we should recognize as our neighbors. The neighbors that this very same man who we have been talking about today is called upon us to love. With all that said, shalom, amen, and blessed be.